All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Ask Her webinar. I am Mercy Chikowore, Director of Communications at Washington Area Women's Foundation. We are a community-supported foundation that invests in the power of women and girls of color in the Washington, D.C. region. We award grants and advocate alongside our partners towards gender and racial justice. Ask Her is the Women's Foundation's interview series with women leaders, our partners, community members, and supporters who work tirelessly for women, girls, and gender expansive people of color. If you hear anything good or see anything good, be sure to tweet during our chat using hashtag #AskHerSeries, and you can follow us at the Women's Foundation, TheWomensFndtn. We would love to welcome everyone joining us today, including Ebony, our ASL interpreter. I made sure I gave her a shout out because she's amazing. And we want to make sure that everyone is able to participate today. Hence why I'm speaking a little slower than usual. And then, of course, we have our special guest today, Bré Rivera of the Black Trans Fund, which is the first national fund dedicated to uplifting and awarding resources to Black trans social justice leaders. So welcome, Ebony. Welcome, Bree. We cannot wait to hear from you, Bree.
Thank you.
But I'm going to keep introducing you. So hold on, because you're amazing. Bree is a program officer at Groundswell Fund, which is the incubator for the Black Trans Fund. She lives her life boldly and unapologetically advocates for issues most impacting the lives of Black and trans people. Prior to joining the Groundswell Fund team, Bree served as the executive director of Trans Sisters of Color Project, the first Black trans-led grassroots organization run by trans women of color in Detroit, Michigan. Shout out to the D. Before becoming an executive director, Bree worked as a research assistant at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and as an HIV tester and counselor and intervention specialist at Wayne State University School of Medicine. Bree is currently on the board of Positive Women's Network USA, a fierce group of diverse women living with HIV. She is a national advisory board member of Positively Trans, as well as a Greater Than AIDS ambassador. Welcome, Bree. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. So you have a very interesting bio. I would love to learn just briefly, like, how did you get in this space? What made you wake up one morning and say, you know what, I'm just going to be this amazing advocate and leader?
Wow. Acknowledging that I've been fighting my entire life. And I think it'd be a missed opportunity to not name and acknowledge the fact that there were folks in positions of power who trusted me and who saw potential in me and who invested in the person that I am now. Yeah, my story is a lot more complicated than we have time to talk about. But yeah, really just naming the fact that, realizing that movement-wide, Black trans folks aren't really trusted to move work. We aren't trusted with our experiences. And yeah, and I wouldn't be here because of that. And just really naming that Vanessa Daniel, Alex Del Valle, Na Hammond, were folks at Groundswell who really and not only saw me as a Black trans leader, but actually like helped develop what is now the Black Trans Fund. Yeah, and shout out to Hunter Day, who was also on the call, who was like my right-hand person, keeping me together, keeping me grounded, loving on me. And Black Trans Fund, also known as BTF, is centered in joy and liberation, and that is everything that we do. And for me, Black Trans Fund wouldn't exist without my experience as a grassroots ED of a Black trans-led organization in Detroit, Michigan, the first.
You have a lot of firsts in your bio, so.
Yeah. Also naming,
we'll dig into that later, but go ahead.
We will definitely dig into that later. But you know, as a grassroots ED, off the bat, I just realized that like folks did not believe that Black trans people actually deserved to experience joy and be liberated in the world. And so for me, as a grassroots ED, it was just a lot of fighting with community that was not Black and trans around what we deserved, how we should be seen in the world, and how we should be involved in larger organizations. Mm-hmm. And just realizing that like myself, other Black trans leaders are really trusted. And so, you know, I started at Groundswell as a fellow, mm-hmm. and really got clear that there was not a space in philanthropy that actually supported Black trans folks from a place of joy. All of the funding and opportunities that I received as a Black trans leader were from a place of like violence and despair. Folks wanted us to talk about violence. Folks wanted us to talk about the discrimination that we faced, and didn't actually want to give us resources to actually create solutions that were based in community. And so when I got the opportunity to move what is now the Black Trans Fund, I was very clear that I wanted to create something that would stand the test of time, and that we were building a long-lasting infrastructure to honor, protect, and fund Black trans lives. And so for me, really quickly naming that for us, funding comes from a place of joy. And when we fund communities from a place of joy, it unlocks possibilities for the folks on the ground. And really quickly wanting to name that a majority of our grantees are running organizations out of their own pocket, mm-hmm. and cannot receive funding from other foundations because of the lack of understanding in movements and in philanthropy as to how Black trans communities are organizing.
So you said a lot. Some of the key words that I heard were believe, and understand. Can we dig just a little bit deeper in what that means as you're talking to funders and advocates or allies in some way, and they just don't believe Black trans people? Like, talk to us more about that.
I think in a broader scale, there is this belief that in order for Black trans bodies to exist and to thrive in the world, that we have to be as close to cis folks as possible. I don't believe that that's true. And so And how that looks in the world is that like folks will say things that apply to cis folks that don't necessarily apply to trans people. And so an example, when folks talk about the disparities of Black trans folks actually being able to secure jobs, housing, and identification, there is always this belief that we should just go out into the world and make things happen without fully understanding how transphobia operates. We live in a country where, in a lot of states, it is legal to discriminate against folks for housing and job opportunities solely on the fact that we are transgender. We also live in a country that makes sex work illegal, which is a income strategy for a lot of Black trans folks because we can't get jobs, right? Mm-hmm. And so as a Black trans person navigating the world, just understanding that our survival is constantly criminalized, mm-hmm. and we are expected to invest in a system that has continuously disinvested in us. And yes. That is the entry point for a lot of our organizations into getting funding. So like work on behalf of the state, right? Mm-hmm. And realizing that regardless to how much work that we put into trying to fix the state, that Black trans folks are always left behind. Yeah. And so when we do our work, we fund communities to actually invest in the work that moves the folks in their community, right? And at the same time, working with our grantees to help them strategize as to how centering, protecting, and providing resources for a community actually makes conditions better, not just for Black trans communities, but for all communities, and moving folks into a place where communities are strong enough and have the resources that they need in order to be able to organize on a larger scale. Wonderful.
And while you were talking to the piece that rang true for me was doing the work with this foundation of joy, that it sparks joy. And I really love that because nothing bad can come from things that spark joy, I hope. You mentioned that you fund folks from a place of joy because it unlocks possibilities. What does that exactly mean in the work that you do? What are these possibilities?
I can give you an example. Mm-hmm. Last year, we were introduced to a group in Atlanta, Georgia, called I Am Human Foundation, mm-hmm. ran by Alex Santiago, a Black trans masculine person. And when we first got on the call, we were doing video interviews at that time. He had on a suit, a tie, very stiff, very like, let me give you the numbers, let me be technical. And some point throughout the conversation, I was like, pause, like, I don't need you to perform. Mm-hmm. Numbers are great, but that doesn't move me. I want to hear about what's bringing folks on the ground joy. Right. We laughed. We talked about like all of the joy work that they were doing on the ground. And I remember him taking a deep breath and being relieved that he didn't have to like do the song and dance for money. Yeah. We were their first foundation. We were the first foundation to support their work. And to see now, they're a leading organization in Atlanta. They have like innovative billboard campaigns. self-defense classes for Black trans folks. They are like feeding, housing folks, and their budget has increased 20-fold. They're hiring people. And I think that that's only possible because of the support of BTF. And I'm saying that as like the grantee, but also getting feedback from Alex.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. And update, Alex no longer wears a tie, so we uplift him. I'm kidding. I don't know Alex, but I'm sure.
He wears ties when it's necessary, but not for me anymore. And
wonderful. But no, I think that sparking of joy is just amazing because it's the catalyst for more. And it's clearly spreading across your grantee partners. But just taking a step back for a second, I would love to take a moment to talk about gender justice. So for some of us, when we hear gender justice or gender equity, we're likely thinking about rights for cisgender women versus cisgender men. But gender justice is so much more than that. So how does the Black Trans Fund define gender justice as a central value in its work alongside Black liberation?
I wanted to be clear and say that there is a difference between gender justice and genital justice.
That is a word. Continue.
Yes, it is. Gender justice allows for folks to be fluid and self-determine how we see and perform gender. Everyone is performing gender, regardless to whether you're trans or not.
Mm-hmm.
And genital justice limits us to what's in between our pants. I'm sorry, what's in our pants. And is harmful not only to gender expansive folks, but has dangerous implication for non-gender expansive folks, meaning cis people. Mm-hmm. And 2 examples, we see a lot of Black women being subject to gender testing in sports, having to prove their gender.
Yeah.
And we've seen across the country, multiple states enact bathroom bills that have been less harmful for trans folks and that have actually been harmful to masculine identified cis women who use bathroom facilities. Also, just really wanting to really quickly say that all cisgender men benefit from the gender justice work that is happening in movements. They don't need to be centered. The reason why that they don't need to be centered is because cis men, especially cis het men, their gender is always validated, honored, and protected, and overvalued. And so, just naming that like queer and trans identified folks or assumed folks mm-hmm. are different than what is traditional. And we have to remember that traditions in this country and a lot of places in the world that have experienced conquest because of colonialism have had our diverse genders erased because of whiteness, right? Whiteness says that men have to be XYZ, women have to be XYZ, and there is a hierarchy that actually devalues women, femmes, anyone who's not cis het, masculine, and puts a value on, a dangerous value on cis het men that allows them to just be dangerous in the world without accountability.
And consequences.
And consequences, yes.
No, yes. Overvalued as in they're always at the top of the list and the totem pole when it comes to funding especially. Mm-hmm. So thank you. And come on with a history lesson. We've actually discussed this quite a bit, especially in talking about healing justice and just the history of white supremacy. and colonialism, slavery, all of this feeds into how we operate today. So thank you for bringing that up. And you mentioned even Black athletes are being tested. What do you think is sparking even that happening? Especially in the year 2021.
Black women are magic. We're winning. And folks don't feel like that's appropriate, right? They always want us to be in a position where we are losing. And as a Black woman, I've never felt like I've lost, you know? And so I think there's that piece, but also I think it's more than just sports. We see it in entertainment where cis women who have had children, who are like the epitome of like what it is to be cis and Black and a woman, their gender gets questioned all the time. Like Serena Williams, for example, she is the greatest of all time.
Yeah.
And people masculinize her all the time. Sierra is an amazing artist. People masculinize her all the time, right? And so I think the easiest way to discredit any Black woman in this country, cis or trans, is to call them a man. Is to tell us we're too loud or too big or too bold.
Right, or our shoulders are too broad.
Okay.
Gotcha, totally, we're here, we're on the same page. And that brings a great point about the way that Black women and girls are treated, which is why at the Women's Foundation, we've really doubled down on investing in the power of women and girls of color specifically. For that reason, everyone deserves funding, everyone deserves opportunity. And if we can open those doors and keep them open, that's what we're here for. So visit thewomensfoundation.org for more information. That is my plug. Next, so in terms of funding, which is something that the Black Trans Fund does, something that we do, let's talk about your 2020 docket report. Your investments, how do you approach grant making and your organizing? Maybe talk more about how your organizing works. And then we can also talk to you about the lack of funding when it comes to Black trans communities.
I think it's important to name that funders for LGBTQ issues put out a report a couple of years ago that names that trans groups get a penny of every dollar that is moved in philanthropy. It's important to name that that's trans groups, that's not Black-led trans groups.
Pause really quickly. I don't think they heard you in the back. So how much do Black trans groups get, or trans groups in general?
Trans groups get a penny of every dollar that is moved in philanthropy.
Okay. So how much do Black trans groups get? It's not funny, but
no, it's not funny.
Gotta laugh to keep from crying sometimes.
Yeah, actually, their study isn't as detailed to like sparse out like Black trans led or like Black trans led dollars. I can say that BTF moves 100% of our dollars to Black trans communities, which is different than how other folks in philanthropy operate. I think it's important to name that, like, for BTF, that statistic made us think a little bit deeply about what coordination was needed in order to move more money to Black trans communities. And part of it is anti-Blackness, right? People don't feel like Black trans folks deserve. One piece. There's also this belief that like national organizations that are like for trans people actually have a clear analysis around Black trans communities and actually center those communities. They don't. We have to beg those same folks for money too. And I think there is an extreme narrative shift that needs to happen in order for philanthropy and movements to understand the intersectionality of the work that Black trans communities are moving, how it saves Black trans communities and other communities. And there is a level of control that Black trans folks don't have in philanthropy that allows for our groups not to be funded at a high level. So, example, for a long time, people were like, you're one of the first Black trans people in philanthropy. I'm not, right? Understanding that, and understanding that like, this was like, what, a year, 2 years ago that folks were saying this? And that we are constantly relying on communities outside of our own to center us, understand our work, and give us dollars. And that's not equitable.
Well, why did they think you were the first?
I think, one, people assume that you have to be out, open, and vocal about your transness. So there's a lot of trans folks that are just erased because people see them as cis people, right? I have had the pleasure of working with Gabriel Foster at Fund for Transgeneration. No, sorry, wrong group again. There's so many groups.
Good.
Trans Justice Funding Project. Sorry, that's the group. Trans Justice Funding Project. And, you know, Black trans masculine person, super helpful in like developing who I am as an individual, and understanding that like Gabriel was one of a few Black trans people who were like holding it down for us, right? And moving money to trans communities. And also just wanting to name that like a lot of times we just get erased as leaders. Folks don't see us, they don't want to see us. And so, you know, that's just a reflection of how blatant transphobia is in philanthropy and larger movements. It's both blatant and covert, right? Yeah. Blatant means that like philanthropy is not going to give you money, right? And then covert is like, not only are we not going to give you money, but we are going to prevent your communities from having access to these spaces to actually shift.
Fascinating when you say they don't want to see us. Yeah, I think there's an interesting attitude around the trans community when it comes to even something as simple as pronouns, or just acknowledging that space. So it's interesting because it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, or a lot of people say it's too hard to remember what to say and how to say it. And I'm like, it's actually not that hard. If you can remember the lyrics to your favorite song, you can call them by their name, whatever name. People have a hard time saying my name, so I get it. But it's interesting that you say that a lot of Black trans specifically are erased from philanthropy, which is why your fund is super important. Talk more about when we talk about philanthropy, there's community-based philanthropy has a long history. Giving circles is one type we know pretty well. Other things that we've seen elevated locally during the pandemic, especially our mutual aid networks. Can you share how mutual aid differs from what many of us might consider philanthropy and the value of those differences?
Mutual aid is community care, caring for our folks, right? And being very clear to name that the mutual aid efforts that happened during the pandemic prevented an economic collapse. Those mutual aid efforts actually were long ago coordinated by trans communities of color, Black trans communities, right? And so Black trans communities have always moved mutual aid efforts. They just have not been funded by philanthropy. Folks told us no in multiple ways, right? Ways that were very nice and ways that were pointed. And naming that, the ballroom community, as folks may know, as that's been popular now because of like TV shows like Pose, is actually really rooted in mutual aid. It's not performance, it's not just entertainment, but Black trans communities, Black trans houses have been using ballroom as a way to support, feed, house, and provide resources to Black trans communities before it became this like trendy thing where everyone's like, oh, we gotta go to the ball, right?
Right.
And really just also wanting to name that like Hollywood, like other movements, have also just really glamorized ballroom without any real context. And the folks who have built ballroom benefited from the mutual aid efforts that have been provided to community because of ballroom, have not received the benefits of ballroom becoming mainstream. We're still begging for resources. We're still homeless. We're still houseless, right? And so just naming that like for Black trans communities, we are always at the end. We are always at the intersection of innovation and exploitation.
Good point. We talked about this briefly about how a lot of trans leaders, or especially Black trans leaders, are also rooted in entertainment. And there hasn't been as much space for others, or the Black trans leaders that are recognized are not necessarily on the ground in the community doing the work, but they're still elevated because of entertainment, essentially, which entertainment is edutainment. Like, I think a lot of people have learned a lot from shows like Pose, but there's still more to learn. Are there any resources you would suggest, or anything you would suggest for folks to get more information on ballroom, mutual aid, any of that that's super relevant to this conversation?
Yes, Pose is a piece, right, of the puzzle, but I think I would like to encourage folks to actually get to the ground. And that means doing research and investing in houses that have been leaders in movement work, the House of Garcon, the House of Latex, to name a few. Ballroom houses that have really been thoughtful about not only how does ballroom like keep our folks like entertained and engaged, but are also doing like tons of like education and support work to keep our communities whole. Those are just two houses that are doing that work really well. And it's just a testament of like how Black trans communities, like even before ballroom, have just been kind of like taking care of folks and holding folks with care. And ballroom is not just like a mutual aid effort, but it's also around safety and provides folks with like camaraderie. Yeah.
That's a perfect segue to our next question. When it comes to the work that you do, so at the Women's Foundation, we do invest in the power of youth of color. We also focus on survivors of gender-based violence and early care and education workforce. And we've noticed through our work that trans leaders specifically are more recognized in anti-violence spaces or end up being tokenized in nonprofit spaces. Let's talk more about that. Have you seen that a lot nationally, locally? I know we mentioned it briefly, but you mentioned anti-violence, or at least violence. So talk more about that.
Yeah. There is a focus on Black trans communities being victims and not victors, right? I think just as a Black trans person waking up every day and surviving speaks in itself. I think there's also a deep sensationalism of violence, despair, murder.
And that's
Right.
something we didn't even mention, the statistics around the number of Black trans who are murdered every year. I believe the number has gone up significantly
It's
over the
gone
past
up
few years.
significantly since Laverne Cox was on the Time magazine cover talking about the trans tipping point. And I am a firm believer that like visibility has benefited us and it has been a disadvantage to us. We are more visible, people see us, we are no longer in the shadows. Also just wanting to name really quickly, shout out to my girls because, you know, cis people are interesting. On one hand, they say that they don't want us to exist and they're violent towards us. But myself, a lot of my homegirls have been actually taking care of cis men since the beginning of time, right? In secret, right? And so also wanting to name that like, I think the sensationalism of like violence and the violence and despair gives cis folks a focus that doesn't allow other people to see that like cis men are attracted to trans women. Down, meaning all day, every day, without a doubt, right? And so it's just another example of like how like Black trans arts, culture, and Black trans bodies are consumed, co-opted, but the conditions have yet to shift. I'm a firm believer that a lot of the aesthetics, especially the video vixen aesthetic, is a trans aesthetic, right? I grew up always curious as to like, oh, the girls got unique shape. They cute. The girls face BB all the time, like morning, noon, night, breakfast, dinner, lunch. You're like, why are you so beat at breakfast, right?
Right.
And like to see how a lot of the influencers are using aesthetics, cosmetic procedures that Black trans women have used for years and have like killed themselves to actually get access to. And without any like, okay, it's whatever. And now starting to like really understand that like there is like a lot of tension in like cis women, trans women communities around like folks' attraction to us without actually like understanding like where a lot of this like aesthetics attraction comes from. And it's sad because Black trans women have been like doing this for years to just kind of like blend into society, survive. And you see like cis folks doing these same procedures as a way to like get more attention and to be like beautiful in the world, right? Yeah, and just wanting to say that.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Yes.
I'm just gonna say before we continue, because I have more questions, if you have any questions, this is your time to put them in the Q&A box. I know you have been holding your questions and, you know, just listening and watching, but please put your questions for Bree about the Black trans community, Black Trans Fund, how to better fund Black trans communities in the Q&A box. This will be your time. And while we're waiting for Q&As, I have more questions.
Okay.
So in terms of your grantee partners, And I know we have a link to your spring donor briefing, which describes some of those partners. Where would you say your funding, what verticals your funding typically go to, or is it kind of across the board? So for right now, like I mentioned, we're focused on gender-based violence and our ECE portfolios. What would you say you're focused on?
So we leave it up to our grantees to do work around violence. That's not a frame that we are interested in taking on, because everyone is taking that frame. And so for us, it's really about joy, liberation, and care. And so when we first started providing grants to community, we recognized that we had a whole bunch of like grantees who were like doing work on behalf of Black trans women, and understanding that for us at BTF, we are more than just a fund, but we are actually a fund that's like shifting how we talk about gender justice and how we support folks in that journey. And so we have a couple of special populations that we are investing in and centering as we build out this fund. Transmasculine folks, understanding that there's a lot of intersections of being trans and masculine that put folks at risk for gender violence, gender-based violence, right? Also centering gender expansive folks. So that's non-binary, gender non-conforming folks, because we also understand that there has been a centering of trans women, trans men, right? And leaving out folks in the middle. And we believe that like all trans folks should have access to resources. We are also investing in groups that normally don't get a lot of funding or attention. So that's like folks with chronic conditions, folks with disabilities. And then we also center a lot of youth work that is happening on the ground, understanding that there's a lot of complications that come with working with Black trans youth. And also seeing that like our youth are under attack in multiple settings, whether it be sports, bathrooms in schools, use of like pronouns and identity, and understanding that like our young folks are going to be the people who are going to be taking over the work that we are laying the groundwork for now.
Yeah.
And so wanting to invest in our young trans folks, because to be honest, it's young trans people that have actually got me to sit down and to think a little bit deeply about my gender, how I express it, and how I show up in the world. Because there is a level of freedom that youth get to experience as they are like finding out who they are for themselves. And it's really inspiring and needs to be invested in.
Exactly why we invest in youth of color. With our Young Women's Initiative, we worked with a number of Black trans youth who, like you said, I learned a lot from personally, and just hearing some of the battles they went through just in high school, walking down the hallway, like you said, going to the bathroom. They would have friends walk them to the bathroom for safety concerns. And even a simple conversation, which is not so simple, about hormones at a younger age and what that entails and where they get them from. Do their parents even give them consent? Because when you're at a certain age, you always have to have your parents sign off on it. So all of those things are things that people often ignore or don't know about. So the work is important, and that's why. So thank you. We have a few questions here. So from Pam, How can trans communities of color, particularly South Asian and Black trans communities, work together to help empower both communities?
I think one of the challenges in getting communities to work together is that anti-Blackness also applies to people of color. And so in my experience, I have seen a centering of trans communities of color, except for Black trans communities. And so I think it's challenging because one of the things that I think we need to do as a community is have more conversations about colonialism, anti-Blackness, and why conditions are different for different communities of color. I am very clear that Black and brown, meaning like Black and brown communities have yet to receive any benefits from the fact that we were colonized and brutalized and brought here, right? And so understanding that like for some communities of color, there was some form of like reparations, some type of support, some type of like government acknowledgement as to like why those communities were wrong. And as a Black trans person, not feeling like that type of work has been put into Black communities. And so saying all that to say, I think one of the best ways that we could work together is actually for folks to sit down and have conversations around political education and why we got to where we are. And for folks to do some like acknowledging and understanding that sometimes anti-Blackness is blatant and sometimes it's covert. Like even as a Black person, I've participated in anti-Blackness because that's how I was trained, right? And I think one of the key tools is like doing a lot of that like decolonization training, education, and we just can't do that in our silos. We have to do that together.
Absolutely. Together is the key word. And we have another question from Pam. Thank you, Pam. How does the Black Trans Fund help address domestic violence in the Black trans community?
Our grantees, again, do that work. I think one of the ways that we address domestic violence is by supporting our grantees with funding. A couple of years ago, there was like this shift to try to like get more cis men a part of the conversation as to like, how do they love, support, and protect us? And I'm very clear that like, there are not a lot of cis folks that actually like understand what it means to be in a loving relationship with trans people and also like standing up for us and supporting us. Transphobia affects cis people in ways in which that doesn't allow them to actually like see, support us, and actually like stand with us. And so, yeah, so for us, a lot of it is supporting our grantees and making sure that our folks have housing, supporting our grantees and making sure that Black trans folks don't have to participate in sex work, which is a key component as to why domestic violence numbers are so high in Black trans communities and actually like violence, like murder, right? Mm-hmm. If you have followed any of the news that's been happening around like Black trans violence, murder, we find that like there is this narrative that like cis folks are killing us because we're not being honest about who we are, and then folks are having sex with us, which is not true, right? Folks are engaging in activities with us and then killing us because of their own transphobia, and it pops up in multiple ways. Either they've been caught, they have a feeling, they don't feel secure in themselves. And so for us, moving away from all of that, because we know we can't really move the needle of that, and really supporting our grantees and being able to provide support systems so that folks can actually survive and thrive.
True. And also I saw a conversation today about what the meaning of phobia is. Phobia is not just a visceral, violent reaction to something. It's also a fear to something and a rejection of something. So that's important to recognize when we say transphobia, what does that mean exactly? So it shows up in so many different ways outside of violence, but funding or lack of funding rather, which is the point of this conversation.
Yes.
Thank you for that question, Pam. And speaking of the work that you do, Robin has a question. You talked about prioritizing joy, liberation, and care. What does liberation look like for Black Trans Fund's work? And maybe some indicators or threads where you see it, where it might be invested in more.
For Black trans folks, liberation for us means being the masters of our own destiny. And so I mentioned earlier that a key component of BTF is not just to fund Black trans communities, but there's also a shift that needs to happen in philanthropy in order for us not to be the only funders of Black trans work. We know that we're not, but we are at a high level. And so for us, liberation looks like funding communities, partnering communities in deep ways. We have grant-making partnerships where we partner with individuals and organizations to move more money to Black trans communities, right? We also have an advisory committee of 7 Black trans leaders from across the country, and we're helping build their muscle, their grant-making muscle, so that when we spin off, that we don't repeat philanthropy's mistake in having a fund that's rooted in really good politics, but actually doesn't reflect the folks that we were talking about. And so Black Trans Fund is 100% Black trans led.
Love to see it.
Yes, and we will always be. And so that's one of the, that's what liberation looks like for us. Investing in our own folks, hiring our own folks, creating possibilities with our own folks. And then where we're talking about investing more, one of the things that's been deeply on my mind and Hunter Day's mind, and we're constantly strategizing around, is capacity building. And so it's not enough to just fund Black trans communities at a high level. We also have to help these organizations build capacity, because for a lot of these organizations, the same way in which that we're investing time and energy in Black Trans Fund to build something that's longstanding, these organizations that are on the ground need to also be in a position to be longstanding, because we understand that the fight for Black trans liberation for the last couple of years has gotten worse, right? Mm-hmm. And will continue until we are put in a position where we have resources, folks actually see us as powerful folks to invest in, folks with brilliance. And right now, a lot of our organizations are struggling with just providing folks with basic needs. And because our organizations are there's so many folks who need, especially now because we're in the middle of a pandemic, mm-hmm. That a lot of our organizations and the leaders don't have enough space and time to be able to think long-term about growth of the organization, what they want, how they want to be in the world. We are constantly in this mode of supporting our communities through the fire, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't give us enough time to build, breathe, and be thoughtful about our futures.
Good point. Capacity building is so important. And then we have one final question here, unless anyone else would like to put in a question. This is your chance before we end. A question from Jennifer. What are the worst mistakes a cis funder can make when raising and granting money for trans-centered work? Thank you. Asking so we can avoid them.
Thank you, Jennifer. One of the things I struggle with as a funder is that understanding, well, knowing for me, there's a two-pronged approach to funding groups, right? I think when folks are thinking about giving, making grants, folks think of the groups that have the most visibility and that are trusted, right? And just because those groups are visible and trusted does not mean that the money goes like back to communities, right? And so I think being very clear as to like, there's a lot of trans-centered work that's happening, but being very clear as to like how you want to plug into funding and then funding that work directly. And so when we do our fundraising asks at BTF, I like to remind folks that like two-prong approach means give to BTF because we are investing in the folks now and we'll continue to invest in folks in the future and helping them build capacity and programming and doing all the great things, right? But there's also an investment that we need to make in organizations on the ground, money that they get directly. And one thing that's innovative about Black Trans Fund is that we pay fiscal sponsor fees on all of our grants to ensure that our groups get what we say that we're going to give them.
Amazing.
Yes, and so the reason why we decided to do that is because when we first started, it felt uncomfortable to give a group a $5,000 grant, knowing that 10% of that money goes to a group that's not Black trans led, right? And we were actually like shortchanging our folks. So we would say, oh, we gave all these groups $5,000, when in actuality, like, no, we gave these groups $5,000, they paid a trans tax, and then they were left with the rest, which doesn't allow for folks to really invest in communities. And so giving to folks directly prevents folks from having to like pay those like fiscal sponsor fees and those taxes for just like existing in the world.
Fantastic. That's something we worked on, particularly because of the pandemic, is getting folks money quickly and directly in their hands. So we appreciate you doing that for your grantee partners and taking on those fees, which I believe everyone should do. But I am just one person. But no, this has been an amazing conversation, and it's sad to say that we're at the end and we only scratched the surface, really, because there's so many things we can talk about. We probably need a part 2, 3, and 4, but we really want to thank you for taking the time to educate us and talk to us about what you're doing at BTF, at the Black Trans Fund. In the chat box, you'll see links to the website along with the docket, more about their grantee partners and their 5-year plan. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't put in the Women's Foundation website, where you can go and participate and donate. You can watch all of our Ask Hers, our Ask Her webinars or Ask Them webinars. Be on the lookout. This is the first we're mentioning this. We have our next Ask Her webinar in October with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. We'll be discussing intersectional feminism. So you cannot say we're not bringing you the best webinars. I know we're all zoomed out, but these are great webinars. And this is definitely one that has sparked joy in me. So Bree, please let us know how else we can support you and the organization and what you're looking forward to next.
Join Liberation. Really quickly, we have a community care grant making cycle that is open. And so folks know of any Black trans led organizations that could use some funding, please, please, please send them our way. That's www.groundswellfund.org/Black Trans Fund.
Fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining. You will receive all of the links that we've shared as well via email. Thank you to our ASL interpreter.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. And Bree, let's talk about a part 2.
Please, please, yes.
All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day and we'll see you soon.